So this is Interstate 275 in Pinellas County, and I drove this route every day for years commuting to and from work. I was completely unaware that just off the shoulder of the road would begin one of Tampa Bay's most darkest and disturbing criminal cases. One involving hidden identities, manipulation, violence, murder, and it spanned decades and crossed state lines. On March 29th, 1995, in Pinellas County, a landscaping crew was cleaning along 275, and one of them stumbled upon something he did not expect. He was cutting grass and he kicked a hard object, and when he looked down, he realized that it was actually a human skull. So after finding the skull, he notified his supervisor, who then called the police, and when the police showed up and determined that it was in fact a human skull, they assumed at that point that there were probably other bones in the area, so they actually called out a forensic anthropologist to the scene. The scene wasn't treated like a typical crime scene, it was actually treated more like an archaeological dig. They set up a grid and had multiple people sifting through the dirt trying to uncover the rest of the skeleton. Every fragment of bone was marked and the location was marked, and the investigators had to put it together almost like a puzzle. The scene was treated this way specifically because they had been exposed to the elements for so long. You know, there's animals out there, and Florida's weather, it rains a lot during the summer, so the drainage ditches are full of water. The bones had at one point been underwater, and it just so happened on this day that it was completely dry. As the investigation continued, they started uncovering more than just bones. They uncovered acrylic nails, a shirt that was tied in a knot sitting next to what would have been the victim's neck. They also found various pieces of jewelry, and they found a breast implant not far from the skeleton. All of this that they found clearly suggested that it was a female, but it wasn't until that they found the pelvis that the forensic anthropologist determined that the victim was a female. All of these items that they found indicated that this was a person that was clearly put together and cared very much about her appearance. Investigators also discovered that there were roots that actually went over the bones, around them, and through them from surrounding trees. So the remains were then transported to the medical examiner's office to be further evaluated. They took an inventory of the different bones found, and they started by trying to determine the age of the victim. After observing the victim's teeth and some of the fusion points on the bones, they determined she was about 18 to 20 years old, and after looking at the skull, they had noticed that she had died of 2 gunshot wounds to the head. They were unable to make a positive identification of the victim, so they decided to try to determine what her ancestry was. They took measurements of her skull and determined that she was of European descent, and they went with those measurements to a forensic artist and had her make a facial reconstruction based on the skull measurements. This facial reconstruction was then released to the media and the public, hoping to generate new leads and discover her identity. Unfortunately, they were still unable to make a determination of her identity, and she was given the name Jane Doe I-275. Detectives were also very aware that this could be a very difficult case to solve because a lot of victims found on the side of roadways are living high-risk lifestyles, and some of them are not even reported missing. 275 isn't just any highway, it's a major road that runs all the way up to Cincinnati. So investigators also knew that this really could have been anyone driving along that highway. Something that a lot of people don't know is that a man named Keith Jesperson was actually a suspect in this case. He was also known as the Happy Face Killer. He traveled along that route extensively, and he was known for strangling women. And they thought back to the crime scene where they found the victim's shirt in a knot. But what really ruled him out as a suspect is that they knew that Jane Doe had died of gunshot wounds to the head, and that was not Jesperson's MO. Most killers have a certain MO that they stick to, so they did not believe that he was actually connected. So once he was eliminated, detectives went back to the evidence to review it all because the case had stalled at that point, and they looked at the breast implant that was found at the scene. One of the things they looked for on the breast implant was for a manufacturer serial number so that they could track what company the breast implant belonged to, in hopes that they could figure out who received that breast implant. Now, this actually paid off. They got a hit at a facility near Orlando, so they went there hoping to find the records of whoever got this breast implant inserted. And when they went there, they were able to get the files for who received that implant, and it came back to a woman by the name of Sharon Comesso. And that is how they finally identified who Jane Doe I-275 was. Before Cheryl became a name in this investigation, she was living and working in Tampa at a club called Mons Venus, and she was hoping to further her career into acting or modeling. She really wanted to be a star. I'm currently in the parking lot of the Mons Venus Adult Club, and it is here in Tampa, and this place plays a big role in the case of Cheryl Comesso. The Mons Venus is where Cheryl met a woman known as Sharon Marshall, and Sharon and Cheryl became friends while working here. They spent time together at the club and outside of it, and through that friendship, Cheryl was introduced to Sharon's personal life and Sharon's stepfather, Franklin Floyd. As I go through this video, I'll be using the name Warren Marshall and Franklin Floyd kind of interchangeably, but just realize it's the same person. His real name is Franklin Floyd, but the alias he uses in this is Warren Marshall. So that is the Mons Venus right there. Concerns had already been expressed about Floyd's treatment and his relationship with his stepdaughter Sharon, and signs of control and inappropriate behavior towards Sharon caught the attention of the other dancers. And the fact that he would come to the club and watch her perform troubled a lot of people. Coworkers also noticed changes in Cheryl herself. They recalled Cheryl arriving at work with visible bruises and marks all over her body, and those injuries raised alarm among the dancers and other staff. And according to witness statements, there was a growing belief that Cheryl was being physically abused and that Floyd was responsible. Tension between Floyd and Cheryl continued to escalate, and several witnesses saw this become public. And one night, actually in the parking lot here in front of me, Cheryl and Floyd had a physical altercation that was intervened by one of the other dancers. Cheryl was escorted to her car, and that was the last time she was ever seen at Mons Venus. And shortly after this night, Floyd and Sharon's trailer in their mobile home park was purposely set on fire and burned to the ground, and investigators believe that that was done to cover up evidence and erase his time here in Florida. So we are driving in what would have been the entrance to the old trailer park that used to stand here. This is now the new apartment complex that stands in the location of the old trailer park. It was here that Cheryl would spend time with Franklin Floyd and Sharon in their trailer. And it's crazy looking at this area decades later that a lot of the people here probably have no idea what once happened on this site. So we are pulling into the St. Petersburg Clearwater Airport, and this airport is actually where Cheryl's car was found. According to the case files, Cheryl was the owner of a 1985 red Corvette that was found abandoned here in the parking lot, and it had sat here in the parking lot for over a month. It was impounded on May 15th, 1989. Now, airports are one of those places where abandoned cars can go unrecognized for a while because people are traveling for long periods out of the country, and it's not uncommon for cars to be parked there that long. And the car was never reported missing, so it wasn't something that the airport police were looking for. Cheryl did not have plans to travel at all. She had no airfare booked, and there were no signs of a struggle in the car. During hours of interviews with the other dancers at the club, there was one specific name that kept resurfacing. He was known to the dancers by the name of Warren Marshall, but what they didn't know is that was only an alias and that his real name was Franklin Floyd. So after Cheryl's disappearance, this is where this case takes a more disturbing turn. Sharon and Warren flee Florida and they go to Oklahoma. But on their way to Oklahoma, they stop in Louisiana where they actually got married. After getting married, they moved to Oklahoma where they took on new identities of Tanya and Clarence Hughes. Clarence knew that the police were looking for him in Tampa in relationship to Cheryl's case, but he knew that they were looking for him as Warren, but the police were not looking for a man named Clarence with a wife named Tanya. So in 1990, once they're living under their new aliases of Clarence and Tanya Hughes, Tanya was the victim of a hit and run, and she died 5 days later of her injuries. At the hospital, the nurses and other acquaintances of Tanya were very concerned and suspicious of her death. They did not think that it was just an accident, and they highly suspected that her husband Clarence was involved. At this time during Tanya's death, her and Floyd were considered suspects in Cheryl's case. It was after Tanya's death that her son Michael was placed into foster care. And during Michael's adoption process, they ran a DNA test to confirm that Floyd was in fact Michael's father, but it turns out that he actually was not Michael's biological father. Floyd was then arrested for a parole violation. When Floyd got out of jail, he attempted to get Michael back, but since he was not the father, he was denied that request. Then on September 12th of 1994, he actually showed up at Michael's school with a gun, and he went to the principal and held him at gunpoint and told him to go get Michael out of his classroom. So he ended up kidnapping Michael and the principal from the school that day. They then drove out into the woods, and Floyd tied the principal to a tree and he took off with Michael. And after being discovered, he told police that Floyd was now on the run with Michael. Police knew that they had to move fast to find Floyd and Michael because they knew that the longer it went on, the less likely that Michael was going to survive. After kidnapping Michael, the news coverage of this kidnapping increased dramatically, and his face and his deceased wife Tanya's face were all over the news. During all this media coverage, something really interesting happened. People recognized the photos of Clarence and Tanya on the news, but they were like, their names aren't Clarence and Tanya, their names are Warren and Sharon Marshall. And so this is where those aliases start coming together, and they realize that Clarence and Tanya went by those names in Oklahoma, but they realized that in Florida, they were the same people who identified themselves there as Sharon and Warren Marshall. He had tried to collect on his wife's life insurance policy, and when they researched that, they realized that the Social Security number that Clarence Hughes gave actually came back to a man by the name of Franklin Floyd. 2 months later, Floyd was arrested in Louisville, Kentucky, and Michael was not with him. He was never seen or heard from again. Authorities received multiple different reports of what had happened to Michael. Some were saying that Michael was in fact deceased, and then there were some reports saying that he was alive and safe somewhere. But Floyd refused to disclose the location of Michael or what happened to him. Years later, in 2014, the FBI interviewed him in regards to Michael's kidnapping, and Floyd did admit that the day of the kidnapping, he had shot and killed Michael. After he was in prison for Michael's kidnapping, Franklin Floyd's truck ended up at a mechanic shop. Now, the mechanic working on his truck found underneath his truck an envelope full of photos of a woman being beaten. She was a woman with dark hair, and the detectives that saw the images noticed that she had distinct tan lines on her body. So they thought that it was possible she was from Florida, Georgia, Alabama, somewhere that it's very sunny. They then sent these images to various police departments down in that area, and once they got to Tampa, that's when the story took even a darker turn. When police saw the photos, they realized that the beating was so bad, there was no way that this woman actually survived. The Tampa police received these images, and after observing them, they had suspicions that it could have been Cheryl Comesso in these photographs. They recognized the shirt of the woman in the photographs as the shirt that they found tied in a knot with Jane Doe's remains. They decided to try to talk to Floyd while he was in prison about these photographs, and he denied ever knowing a woman named Cheryl. But when he saw the pictures of her, he replied with, "Yeah, I think I knew her." So they actually went to Warren's trailer back in Florida, hoping to identify the inside of the trailer as the background in these images. But when they went, they discovered it had been totally destroyed by the fire. So they showed the images to a neighbor that lived near Warren and Sharon, and she identified that those photographs were taken inside of Warren's trailer by looking at the couch and the paneling in the background. So with all this evidence, they did determine that Cheryl Comesso was indeed the woman in these photos. So after all of this, after Floyd is convicted of Michael's kidnapping and Cheryl's murder, there's a question that still is bothering the investigators, and that's, well, who is Sharon Marshall, aka Tanya Hughes? Like, we know those are not her real names, so who is she? And they knew that the only answer to that was going to be coming from Floyd himself. And after multiple visits, he finally gave away the name of the woman. Her name was Suzanne. And he had abducted her when she was 4 years old, raised her as his stepdaughter, and then later married her to try to conceal their identities. So it was a very dark, twisted story, but investigators had suspected that she had been kidnapped as a child because he had a past of kidnapping. So then he goes into the story of how he abducted her and stuff, and it was very disturbing also. He said that Suzanne's mother had fallen on hard times and was having a hard time providing for the children. And he just met her one day and said, basically, like, hey, if you marry me, like, I'll take care of you, basically. And so she did. And she went to jail for 30 days for writing bad checks. And while she was in jail, he kidnapped Suzanne and took off, and they were never heard from again. Suzanne's mom went to the police and said, you know, he took my daughter. Nothing really was done after that. And so they just disappeared. No one knew where they went. No one knew that they were going by all these different names. And the mystery remained for decades. After his conviction of Cheryl's murder, he received a death penalty, and he spent the remainder of his life in Union Correctional Institution here in Florida, and he ended up dying of natural causes on January 23rd of 2023.